Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here in the Sound Transit boardroom. My name is Kevin Desmond. I'm the General Manager of King County Metro Transit. And joining me here this morning is Joni Earl, CEO of Sound Transit. Representing Community Transit, CEO is Todd Morrow. Lynne Griffith, CEO of Pierce Transit. John Clauson, the incoming Executive Director for Kitsap Transit. And Tom Hinkson, the Director of Everett Transit. We are the 6 public transit agencies in the central Puget Sound area. We're here today to call attention to a bill making its way through the U.S. House of Representatives that, if passed, will retreat on a national transportation funding consensus created during the Reagan administration some 30 years ago, and will have a dramatic impact on transit, not just nationally, but here in the Puget Sound region and the state of Washington. This bill, called H.R. 7, would put millions of local and regional transit dollars at risk by ending longstanding dedicated funding for transit. If the bill is approved by Congress, it will strip all guaranteed transit funding from the Federal Highway Trust Fund for the first time in 3 decades, adding more volatility and uncertainty to an already financially stretched transit industry. Dedicated transit funding was part of a new transportation trust fund created in 1982 landmark legislation supported by then-President Reagan. Instead of receiving dedicated and predictable federal funds each year, the bill would shift these revenues to a smaller one-time alternative transportation account set to expire in the year 2016. The move would leave transit systems scrambling to compete with other programs for the smaller pot of money within the federal general fund. One should ask, why should highways funding be dedicated, sustained, and predictable, and not transit funding? Indeed, is transit really an alternative form of transportation? Ask the millions of Americans and thousands of people here in the Puget Sound region who rely on public transportation every day to get to jobs, community centers, medical appointments, school, etc. It's no secret that our region's transit agencies have been struggling in recent years due to the shrinking revenues brought on by this Great Recession. If approved, this measure in the House of Representatives would further shrink our budgets. It will also eliminate one of the few remaining, or it could reduce one of the few remaining predictable funding sources for preventive maintenance and capital investments that we need to support our economy that's finally growing again. So what does this mean for all the transit agencies here today? To put this into context, we collectively received about $324 million from federal funds in federal grant revenue in the year 2011. That number represents thousands of seats on buses and rail and jobs in our region. I'm going to turn it to each of our colleagues who will give you a perspective from each of the agencies. First, I want to introduce my friend and partner, Joni Earl, CEO of Sound Transit.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. The House of Transportation's bill that Kevin just described represents a complete abandonment of the 30-year bipartisan consensus that has prevailed about how to fund surface transportation. Ending guaranteed funding for transit would take the trust out of the trust fund and pose grave threats to Sound Transit projects and services. The consequences would be particularly great for building mass transit expansions, especially coming on top of the recession's 25% reduction to our revenues. The House bill calls into question some key assumptions built into our capital plan here at Sound Transit in both the short term and long term, undermining our ability to deliver on key projects. Those include our light rail extensions to the University of Washington, Bellevue and Redmond, Linwood and Federal Way, and our Tacoma Link system. It's crucial that our congressional delegation work to defeat this bill. Even though the University Link project is already well into construction, the Federal Transit Administration may be challenged to keep up with the payment schedule for our $813 million full funding grant agreement. Last year, we already saw the funding pressure through a $6 million haircut to that annual appropriation. If the Ways and Means Committee bill were enacted into law, what's perceived as future haircuts would leave us looking a lot balder in the years ahead. Long term, the bill would undermine the assumption of the ST2 plan that voters adopted in 2008 that the federal government will continue to be a strong partner. If this bill became law, the FTA would have little choice but but to scale back its assumptions about the availability of money for future New Starts projects. They would most likely restrict access to the pipeline for projects already seeking federal funding. This House bill threatens not only our commuters, but also the region's economic recovery. History has shown the economic stimulus that comes in terms of jobs when you're building infrastructure. Here at Sound Transit's projects, as an example, when we use the Washington State Office of Financial Management estimates, every $1 million in construction project spending generates about 10 full-time annual direct and indirect jobs. The benefits extend far beyond the employees in these jobs. Every tax dollar invested in public transportation generates an average of $6 in economic returns. I won't go into the detailed numbers other than to say just currently right now our University Link Light Rail, as an example, Seattle to UW, is about more than 20,000 direct and indirect jobs. So it's critical that we have the transit infrastructure dollars similar to the highway infrastructure dollars for our local and regional economy. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce Todd Morrow, the acting CEO of Community Transit.
Thanks a lot, Joni, and good morning. Next Monday, February 20th, Community Transit is implementing its second major service cut due to this economic downturn. Combined with cuts in June 2010, we will have reduced our bus service by 37% compared to just 2 years ago. These changes have been devastating to our customers, who now have no bus service on Sundays and will soon have no late-night bus service and very limited service on Saturdays. As transit agency directors, we can't wait for the economy to recover. In the meantime, we've been pushing our state and federal leaders for increased funding to preserve and restore transit service. H.R. 7, under consideration now in the U.S. House, goes in the opposite direction. It puts the only federal money we could rely upon in jeopardy. It does this by proposing, as you've heard, to eliminate the mass transit account, which was established in the Reagan era to fund transit through ongoing, dedicated gas tax revenue. H.R. 7 would end what has worked so well since 1983. Any accountant or head of household knows that you can't plan to spend money you aren't sure will come through. Because of this uncertainty that federal funding will even be there, community transit could be forced to spend its own local dollars on programs now covered by this federal money. That could lead to another service cut of as much as 9% of our bus service. It is our hope that the U.S. House of Representatives will kill this proposal to eliminate the dedicated mass transit account. And of course, I'd rather be here making the strong case why Congress should increase funding for transit service. Instead, we're here trying to prevent a catastrophic reversal of Congress's commitment to public transportation. And now I'd like to introduce Lynne Griffith, the CEO of Pierce Transit.
Thank you, Todd, and good morning. I am the CEO of Pierce Transit, the suburban system to the south of Atlanta, and unlike community, or similar to community transit, we too have experienced 3 service reductions through the period of the economic recession. Cumulatively, 43% of our service has ended. Losing another dedicated funding stream represented by the federal funds would be another blow economically. We collect right now $7.6 million annually. It's about a 6% reduction in our revenue stream should that go away. Cumulatively, over our 6-year plan, it could represent an additional 28% reduction in service, or a total of 71% of the public transportation system being gone in Pierce County. It's simply not acceptable. Citizens have already expressed the deep inconvenience associated with getting to jobs, getting to medical appointments, and getting to school through the losses of services that we've already experienced. This would be another significant economic blow. At this point, I'd like to introduce John Clauson, who is the incoming Executive Director of Kitsap Transit.
Thank you, Lynne, and good morning. For Kitsap Transit, one of the smaller agencies in the Puget Sound, this is going to be a rather significant blow for our operation. We use our federal funding, which is anticipated to be in the neighborhood of about $4 million, primarily for capital needs. That means that we will no longer be able to depend on these fundings to plan for equipment replacement, capital improvements such as van pools, park and rides, things of this nature, which for us is going to have a devastating impact. Just to give you a quick example of how it will affect us, over 50% of our fleet is made up of small buses that have a lifespan of between 5 and 7 years. If we don't have a dependable source of funding that we can use to plan for replacements, we're going to have to reduce service like my friends here around the Puget Sound to be able to make the monies necessary to be able to purchase the vehicles to keep the operation running and running efficiently. So this, as I said, is going to be very negatively impacting our operation. We, like the other transit systems in the Puget Sound, have had to reduce service because of the economic downturn, and I'm afraid that this will probably result in additional cuts to be able to keep the equipment going that we need. I'd like to now turn it over to my friend Tom Hinkson, who's the Transit Director for the City of Everett.
Thank you, John. As the smallest agency in the Puget Sound region, we count on about $1 million a year from federal funds for the same purposes of replacing buses and assisting us with our vehicle maintenance. But more importantly, last week we celebrated 10 years of the building of Everett Station, in which the federal government had contributed a little more than $26 million of a $43 million project. If the proposed conditions had existed 12 years ago, there would be no Everett Station, because a little agency like Everett Transit wouldn't have had a chance to get that kind of money. It now serves 7 transit agencies, Sound Transit, it serves Greyhound, Amtrak. I shudder to think of other projects throughout the nation and in this region that won't be built because there won't be federal money. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Desmond.
So from the King County Metro Transit story, as far as specific impacts on Metro, we received in 2011 approximately $65 million in dedicated transit funding from the federal government. And this is the type of money, meat and potatoes, bread and butter kind of money that we get from the feds. It's predictable, that we count on every year, that would be put at risk by this dramatic change that the House of Representatives is currently debating, and would almost certainly put us in a deeper financial hole than what we're in now. Many of you are aware of our struggles, well-documented struggles over the last few years, and as our colleagues have talked about it as well, to preserve service here in the King County region. Make no mistake, this House bill would pose a setback in everything that we've done to maintain service and hopefully put us in a position to maintain service going forward, if not add to service. You'll recall the public outpouring of concern last summer when as much as 17% of the Metro system was at risk as a result of our significantly declined sales tax revenue. That public debate was brought to the County Council, where the County Council last summer created a congestion reduction charge, bridge funding to keep Metro services at least through the year 2014. Passage of this proposal by the House of Representatives in H.R. 7 could likely mean the loss of even more money to keep buses moving at a time when our ridership is in fact increasing, and our ridership in this region has been increasing over the past year. At stake for Metro is the inability to do everything from preserving service to buying new buses, given the year-to-year financial uncertainty. For example, later on this year, we'll be issuing proposals to replace our entire electric trolley bus fleet, 160 vehicles. That's a procurement well in excess of $200 million. A significant portion of that we are expecting federal funds to pay for those very expensive buses. Our Rapid Ride program has been heavily leveraged by the federal government. The capital budget for our 6 Rapid Ride bus rapid transit lines is about $190 million, $120 million of which is being provided by the federal government through various different programs, primarily the Small Starts program. We've used federal money to leverage our local dollars to expand our system, to improve our system, and that also means jobs in this region, people putting these systems in place, constructing these systems. We use our federal revenue to preserve our assets in a state of good repair, buses, equipment, facilities, which leverage the other tax dollars and tax revenues that we collect from the taxpayers of King County, as well as third-party partners. Oftentimes, we create partnerships to manage these projects, as Tom Hinkson pointed out on the Everett station is a good example of that. And these partnerships, this leveraging of the important federal revenue helps to create jobs in our region. The loss of federal revenue would mean that we'd have to choose between service and capital, between state of good repair for our assets and service on the road. That's a very, very difficult choice. So there's a lot at stake with this bill and this debate in Congress right now. On the Senate side, a bipartisan vote in a Senate Finance Committee approved a different approach that would preserve the mass transit account in the Highway Trust Fund. We would urge Congress to reconsider what the House bill is thinking of enacting and maintain the consensus that has been in place for some 30 years on transportation funding nationally.